There's something else from that vice presidential debate on Tuesday night that I want to bring up. It's an argument that both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have been making regularly on the campaign trail, and Vance specifically made this argument a couple of times during the debate with Tim Walz. And it's this idea that, well, Kamala Harris is the vice president already. She's been in office for 3.5 years. All of these big ideas she's proposing, all of these great, incredible plans that she has for when she gets elected president, if her plans are so great and if she's going to solve all these problems, well, why hasn't she done it already? She's been in office for 3.5 years. Why wait till the election? Why wait till Inauguration Day? She's in office right now. Why not just implement all of her plans? And for those of you who didn't take civics class, either because you're not an American and you don't know the details of how American government work, which, hey, fair enough. And also for those of you who are Americans and maybe should know the details of how our government works, but don't for whatever reason, there's a very simple answer for why Kamala Harris has not implemented any of the policies that she's proposing for her presidency yet. And it's summed up really well in this response from a guy who took part in a roundtable discussion, a focus group held by MSNBC that convened after the debate was over.
We were talking, Marcus, about this constant criticism about the vice president not being able, about the vice president being in office for these last, he's already upset about it. The vice president being in office for all these years and not being able to make the change was the allegation from J.D. Vance. You said to me, I've been to high school civics class. Why did you say that?
Because if anybody took high school civics class, they'd know what the vice president can do and what the vice president can do. I want to make a quick point. Neither candidate on that stage talked about what executive action they're going to take on day one to do what they want, nor were they asked, because they know that they can't. That's not how the vice presidency works. You don't get to do what you want. You do what the president delegates you to do.
Yeah. To put it simply, the vice president can't do that. The vice president doesn't have the executive power that Vance and Donald Trump are pretending that it does. In fact, the president doesn't have the kind of far-reaching executive power that Vance and Trump are saying. It's not just a reminder that either they don't know how government works or they're just assuming that the people they want to vote for them don't know how government works and won't be able to see through this argument and tell immediately that it's bullshit. But it's also a glimpse at the kind of president that Donald Trump wants to be and assumes he will be. I'll just do stuff. If Congress won't cooperate with me, if they won't pass the bills I want them to pass, well, then I'll just do stuff. And there's no consideration for the limitations of executive power. Like, presidential executive power has been greatly expanded since the office was created with the enactment of the Constitution. But there are still some pretty hard limits on what a president can do unilaterally, as there should be, as I hope there continue to be. The president of the United States can't just do stuff. For the most part, there are certain things a president can do through executive order, but if he or she, if the president wants to implement some kind of drastic change or some kind of radical new policy, especially one that's going to require significant funding, they don't have the power to do that. Congress holds the power of the purse. Congress is the legislative branch. Congress is the one that's supposed to pass the laws. The president, in theory, is supposed to be in charge of carrying out the laws. That's why it's the executive branch. So if the president can't do all of the things that Vance and Trump are saying, well, why didn't Kamala Harris do it? Then the vice president, which is the office that Kamala Harris presently occupies, definitely can't do it. And it makes me wonder, does J.D. Vance know what office Kamala Harris currently occupies? Does he know? Does he know what office he is running for? Because he's on the ticket to be the VP. He knows that when he becomes vice president, he's not going to be able to just decree whatever he wants to happen and it will be done. Right? the vice presidency of the United States is a very important office. I'm not here to denigrate the office of vice president. It's a crucial office. But in terms of power, the vice president essentially has no innate executive power. The very first vice president of the United States ever, John Adams, described it as the most insignificant office ever conceived. John Nance Garner, who was one of FDR's vice presidents, famously described the office of vice president as being, quote, not worth a bucket of warm piss. And in the 2000 election cycle, when John McCain eventually became the runner-up for the Republican nomination to George W. Bush, and people asked McCain if he would be interested in becoming George W. Bush's running mate to become his vice president, McCain also famously said that he wasn't interested because there are two primary duties of the vice president. One, to inquire daily as to the health of the president, and two, to attend the funerals of third world dictators. And he wasn't particularly excited about doing either one of those things, so he was going to pass on being the VP. That's the office that Kamala Harris currently occupies. That's the office that J.D. Vance is hoping to occupy if the election goes the way that I certainly hope it will not go. And you might be asking yourself now, if this is so obvious, if this is just a misunderstanding, probably deliberate on the part of Trump and Vance, of basic American civics, if they are just attaching powers and abilities and responsibilities to the vice president that don't exist in an effort to attack Kamala Harris, why haven't Harris and Tim Walz, her running mate, responded to this and pointed out this very obvious fallacy with what Trump and Vance are doing? And I think the reason why they haven't really hit back on that point as hard as we might want them to is that they're in kind of a sticky situation themselves. As the sitting vice president, Kamala Harris wants to run on Joe Biden's presidential record and be able to claim that record as at least partially hers, because Biden, regardless of what Republicans say, and they will tell you a very different story that is not rooted in reality, but regardless of what they say, Joe Biden, at least domestically, has been a very effective president. So they can't just say, come on, she's the VP, she has no power. You want it to seem like she had something to do with it. So I understand why Harris and Walz are kind of hanging back on this one. But that doesn't mean the rest of us have to. That doesn't mean the rest of us are not completely within our rights to point out every single time that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance pull out this argument and try to say, well, I mean, if Kamala Harris's plans are so great, why hasn't she put them into practice yet? She's already the vice president. She's been in office for 3.5 years. Next time they do that, we're all completely within our rights to point out that she hasn't done it because the vice president doesn't have the power to do that. Now, when she becomes the president, she will have the power to do a lot of that and will have the power to push for Congress to pass legislation and to implement her policies and to fund her programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as vice president, she doesn't have the power to do that. So she hasn't done it. That's the reason. The vice president has really only one important constitutional duty, and that is to preside over the United States Senate, which most of the time the vice president does not personally do. Usually it's the president pro tempore, or the president pro tem, as it's usually called, of the Senate, that actually presides over the sessions of the United States Senate. The vice president usually is only personally there when the vice president's vote is needed to break a tie, because as the constitutional president of the Senate, the vice president also gets a vote on legislation that is considered by the Senate, but the vice president usually doesn't actually cast a vote unless it's needed to break a tie, because otherwise what would be the point? So Kamala Harris has done that. Mike Pence did that. All vice presidents have done that when necessary, have shown up in the Senate to cast a tie-breaking vote. And beyond that, the responsibilities of the vice president are whatever the president says they are. In fact, when J.D. Vance thinks about the kinds of things that he would like to do if, heaven forbid, he becomes vice president, he should probably familiarize himself with what some of these traditional roles have been. Because even though it's almost none of it is defined in the Constitution, there are certain things that presidents in the recent past have tended to delegate to the vice president, and not just attending the funerals of third world dictators, as John McCain said, but other things, important things. I really don't want J.D. Vance to be the vice president, because if J.D. Vance is the vice president, that means Donald Trump is the president, and that's a horror show. That's a nightmare that we've already had, and we don't need to repeat that. But if the election goes the way I definitely don't want it to go, and J.D. Vance does find himself as the vice president of the United States, and he's looking for something to do, one of the roles that the vice president has traditionally played is as the head of the space program. And that has taken various specific forms over the years. Right now, there's a body within the executive branch called the National Space Council, and the vice president is typically appointed as the chairman of the National Space Council. And the National Space Council is basically an advisory group to the president on the space program and what our space policy should be. So presumably, if Trump is elected and Vance is his vice president, Vance would be the chairperson of the National Space Council. And I personally would love to see him really throw himself into that role. I would love to see J.D. Vance become a very active participant in the American space program in the event that he becomes the vice president. As a matter of fact, I think it would be really great if J.D. Vance would become such an active participant in the space program that he actually volunteered to go into space himself. I think that would be a great thing. And you know what? Trump and Vance, their campaign, they're so cozy with Elon Musk already. And Elon Musk's, one of his other companies is SpaceX, which is a contractor with NASA and regularly flies astronauts up and down from the space station. If J.D. Vance wanted to go to outer space, he could just call up Elon Musk and say, hey, could I get a ride on a SpaceX ship? That would be perfect. Although now that I think about it, it would probably be best for everybody involved, especially the American people and the United States as a country, if when J.D. Vance, if he's vice president, does decide to go into space, if actually he doesn't take a SpaceX spacecraft. I think it would be better for everybody around if he flew Boeing.